The Committee on House Administration will come to order. I have a gavel. And I'd now like to call the roll so that we will know that we have a quorum present. First, I am here. I'll ask Mr. Davis, are you present? Mr. Davis, I see you. Say here.
Yes, I'm present. I had to get to unmute.
Okay. Mr. Raskin is not present. Mr. Walker of North Carolina? Not present. Ms. Davis of California?
Present.
Mr. Loudermilk of Georgia?
Present.
Mr. Butterfield of North Carolina?
Present.
Ms. Fudge of Ohio?
Present.
And Mr. Aguilar of California?
Present.
So a quorum is present. I would like to thank the members of the committee and our witnesses. Yes, ma'am.
Just a quick point of order. I do know Mark Walker is on, so for the initial period of attendance, he is here. He's having difficulty with the video, so I think the team is working on the video for him.
Very good. We will note that in for the record.
Thank you.
We're holding this hearing in compliance with the regulations for remote committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 965. Section 5 of House Resolution 965 requires this committee to, quote, study the feasibility of using technology to conduct remote voting in the House and, quote, to provide certification to the House upon a determination that operable and secure technology exists to commit remote voting in the House. Today's hearing will explore the technological and security issues surrounding remote voting and will inform our study of these issues. As we begin, I want to remind all our members and participants of a few things that will help us navigate this platform. We're holding this hearing in compliance with the regulations for remote committee proceedings pursuant to the resolution. However, the fundamental nature of the hearing and our rules are unchanged. Generally, the committee will keep microphones muted to limit background noise. When we meet in person in our committee room, members need to unmute themselves when seeking recognition or when recognized for their 5 minutes. Witnesses will also need to unmute themselves when recognized for their 5 minutes or when answering a question. Members and witnesses, please keep your cameras on at all times. If you need to step away for a moment during the proceedings, please leave your cameras on and do not leave the meeting within the WebEx platform. And at this time, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to extend their remarks and that any written statements may be made part of the record. And hearing no objection, that is so ordered. This is our first virtual full committee hearing, and it's fitting that I'm joining you from Silicon Valley. In recent months, the House has made important use of new technology, including virtual hearings, to continue operations during the COVID pandemic. These advances are particularly noteworthy because as an institution, the House has not always been quick to adopt technology to its legislative procedures. A young inventor once observed that what he called, quote, the enormous waste of time in Congress, unquote, spent taking roll call votes. So that 21-year-old invented an electronic system that would permit instantly and accurately recording members' votes, quote, thus avoiding loss of valuable time consumed in counting and registering the votes and names, and saving time for more important substantive legislative business. But when he presented his idea to Congress, he was told it would impair the ability of the minority to influence legislation. So that electrographic vote recorder and register, described in the first of more than 1,000 patents that Thomas Edison was issued, was essentially ignored by Congress. So I'd ask unanimous consent to enter Mr. Edison's patent number 9646 into the record, and without objection, that is ordered. It would take another 20 years for anyone to introduce the first bill to permit a form of electronic voting. By the time the House took its first electronic vote in 1973, more than a century had passed since Edison first suggested the idea. It also took more than 40 years from the time members of the House first appeared on live television to the time that cameras were allowed to broadcast live proceedings on the House floor. It's not unusual for any institution steeped in history and precedent to resist change. That was the case for the House when it came to advances like electronic voting and televising our proceedings, both of which we take for granted today. But we can't afford that attitude today in the face of the COVID crisis. That's why the House recently passed a resolution to ensure that we can continue to govern during the coronavirus pandemic. The resolution authorized new ways to conduct our legislative business. For example, the House authorized remote committee proceedings like this one. The House also authorized remote directed proxy voting on the floor, and the House directed further study of a third possible tool, remote voting. That review is the purpose of today's hearing. In some respects, these are new tools for governing, but they're within our authority to implement, and they're not intended to replace our regular order. To the contrary, they represent prudent and responsible steps to ensure that the House can continue to lead during this crisis. As the resolution makes clear, they are intended to be used only during extraordinary circumstances. There can be no doubt that these are extraordinary times. Our nation and the world continue to grapple with the devastating spread of a historic pandemic, and the spread of the disease in the United States is worsening. Today, more than 3.5 million Americans have been confirmed to have COVID. That's a greater number than the population of 21 individual states. More Americans have died in the last few months from COVID than were killed in all military conflicts the U.S. has fought since World War II combined. Plus, because of the continuing problems with access to testing, we don't know for sure how many Americans have actually contracted the virus, but the experts believe the actual figure could be as high as 20 million. We're still learning about how highly contagious this deadly virus is and how it spread, what steps can be taken to mitigate its further spread. New reports have suggested that the immunity gained by those who recover from COVID could be short-lived. As bad as things already are, cases are continuing to rise in more than 40 states. This week, the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Dr. Redfield, said he believes, quote, the fall and winter of 2020 and 2021 are going to be probably one of the most difficult times that we have experienced in American public health, unquote. This crisis demands legislative action and oversight and the continued work of the Congress, and it also means that we have a responsibility to the institution and the American people to explore additional ways to be able to continue work in the face of the pandemic. Consider the alternative. In a number of states, outbreaks among state legislators have impacted the ability to conduct state business. In Mississippi this week, more than 40 legislators and staff, including at least 30 members, are positive for the disease. The Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor, who presides over the Senate, are both positive. That has left the state government in limbo, with significant pending business unfinished. In several other states, tragically, legislators have died. Here in Congress, nearly 60 members have publicly disclosed that they tested positive, self-quarantined, or had otherwise come in contact with someone who was positive. At one point, at the same time, at least 22 members of the House had either tested positive, were presumed positive, or were in self-quarantine because of someone who they had been exposed to who was positive. That's in addition to the scores of other institutional led branch staff who contacted COVID, including personnel from the Capitol Police, the architect of the Capitol, the GPO, and others. I'm mindful that many people are putting themselves at risk by working on the front lines every day. From doctors and nurses to police officers, firefighters, and paramedics, to transit workers and truck drivers, among others. As the daughter of a truck driver and a school cafeteria cook, I deeply appreciate everything people in many critical lines of work are doing to support their communities and the country, even at risk to their own health. However, we in Congress have an option that most of these vital frontline workers do not have. We can do our work remotely in a safe, secure, online format. online format. We've already taken a number of significant steps to do that. In just 2 months, the House has held 29 votes, which included remote directed proxy votes. These votes have produced legislation signed into law by the president. House committees have held more than 86 committee hearings and markups. These events have included more than 185 hours of testimony, questions, statements, and debate. Of those committee events, 78 were hearings, and of those hearings, 49 were fully remote, 29 were hybrid, during which some members were in Washington while others participated remotely. More than 226 individuals have provided testimony as witnesses in remote or hybrid hearings. In addition, in April, the Speaker directed the creation of an electronic and all electronic hopper to permit the virtual submission of all floor documents, including bills, resolutions, co-sponsors, and extension of remarks via a dedicated and secure email system. Since the policy took effect, 1,307 measures have been filed electronically, while just 51 were filed using the old process. And in my capacity as chairperson of the Joint Committee on Printing, I directed the DPO to accept for publication in the Congressional Record extensions of remarks submitted with the member's electronic signature. Under this new, more convenient system, members have filed 897 extensions of remarks by email. All of these are remarkable changes in the history of the institution. We've acted swiftly to use technology because when we maximize our remote work, we minimize needless exposure of everyone who works on Capitol Hill, and that includes the Capitol Police, the cleaning staff, other institutional staff, the press, legislative staff, and members. Virtual and hybrid committee events have been, by and large, very successful. Although there have been some relatively small number of technical issues, in considering these, it's important to keep in mind that expanding use of virtual or remote congressional activity, where appropriate, ensures that we can continue to act in a manner that is safe for the legislative branch workforce, while also preserving precious testing equipment and supplies for frontline workers who don't have jobs that can be performed remotely. The highest levels of all three branches of our federal government have recognized the need to adapt our work in the 21st century, and that we can do so in a safe, secure, and transparent way. In addition to the changes we've made in the House, the Senate has held numerous virtual hearings. The Supreme Court, which long resisted modest attempts to increase transparency and public access to its proceedings, has heard oral arguments by conference call. These important cases involve critical congressional oversight prerogatives, and for its part, the executive branch has recognized the legitimacy of these proceedings by participating in virtual or remote proceedings of both chambers of Congress and the Supreme Court. Now, as I mentioned, I represent Silicon Valley, which has become synonymous around the world for technology and the spirit of innovation. We in Congress must adopt the entrepreneurial spirit and openness to new technology that made my community a global leader and apply it to the procedural and logistical challenges we face in our legislative operations, as well as to a strategy to respond to and overcome the coronavirus. Remote voting could be another powerful tool to permit the House to continue its work. The Committee on Rules has already had significant discussions about the constitutional basis and foundation for using technology to bolster legislative operations during the pandemic. So that's not the focus of this committee hearing today. Our purpose is to assess the specific issue of the feasibility of using technology to conduct remote voting in the House. With that in mind, I look forward to hearing from our esteemed panel of witnesses. I would now like to recognize our ranking member, Rodney Davis, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. This is a great opportunity for us to, let me get my audio stuff taken care of here. I apologize. Chairperson, thank you for holding today's hearing. I appreciate hearing from the majority about the different provisions that the House has passed already to deal with the coronavirus. We came together for 4 very important bills that dealt with saving our economy, making sure that we allowed small businesses to survive and sustain themselves during this pandemic. But the provisions that were put in place, as was mentioned by the chairperson, were not done by the House as a whole. They were done by the majority. Remote voting is being discussed because it's a provision that was recommended by the majority in the House only. There are many of us who have concerns with the provisions that are in place for proxy voting and for remote and hybrid hearings. And I appreciate, though, today that we're going to discuss the feasibility of remote voting, because regardless of our concerns, we have to make sure that we debate the merits of any provisions, even if they're pushed through by only the majority. I think this is an important conversation. I hope the transparent process continues before the majority decides to move forward with implementation. I'd like to welcome all of our witnesses, especially former Speaker Gingrich. I believe the speaker offers a unique perspective, and I do appreciate his willingness to participate. I hope with the long opening statements, Mr. Speaker, that this is not a delay game since you're across the Atlantic Ocean and on a different time schedule, but stick with us. I think America needs to hear what you're going to say on this issue. But before we discuss the possibility of remote voting, I think it's important to lay out where we are now, how we got to this point, and the process that has driven the operational decision-making of this institution during the COVID-19 pandemic. When this coronavirus began spreading across our country and the rest of the world, we knew it was only a matter of time until we would be impacted in the people's house. In March, there was a bipartisan effort to quickly transition thousands of staff to telework. That was an enormous lift and only made possible through the tireless work of the chief administrative officer, which I must add didn't exist until Speaker Gingrich was Speaker of the House, and then also the Sergeant at Arms offices. And I'd like to thank Chairperson Lofgren for working in a very bipartisan way to make that happen. Then the conversation turned to additional procedural changes that would be required for the House to continue to operate. These efforts did not incorporate bipartisan input. On March 23rd, Democrats released a report concluding remote voting in any form would almost certainly cause unintended consequences if not done with adequate forethought and discussion. And change cannot be implemented overnight and likely cannot be accomplished in time to address the current crisis. Well, despite this, and without any public hearings or bipartisan support, the majority passed HRES 965 on May 15th, which authorized proxy voting, remote committee proceedings, and authorized remote voting pending a certification from Chairperson Lofgren. Since the implementation of HRES 965, 572 proxy votes have been cast on the House floor, dozens of virtual hearings and markups, and a lawsuit filed in federal court on the grounds that proxy voting is unconstitutional. During today's hearing, we will hear lots of discussion on IT capabilities that could support remote voting, the types of requirements such a system should have to safeguard against threats, and examples of entities already using remote voting. 4 months before this hearing, when it became apparent the direction of the Democratic majority and where they were heading, I directed my team to formally engage with the GAO to better understand remote voting technologies. This engagement has been productive, and I'm confident that there is a technology that exists to support remote voting. I also have confidence in the clerk and her staff's ability to execute if directed. What I'm concerned about is that the House seems to be in a very reactionary posture, with sweeping changes being made with little consideration around longer-term impacts. We have already seen numerous hearings and markups disrupted by technical difficulties, resulting in the nature of those proceedings changing. Fewer standalone amendments being made in order for floor consideration, increased usage of en bloc amendment packages at committee hearings and on the floor, and dozens of examples of members from both parties not following the prescribed regulations with no consequences. No one can say with a straight face that these trends are a good thing or that the quality of the deliberative process that is the hallmark of the House hasn't been sacrificed. Over the last 6 months, we've seen essential workers across our nation step up, make sacrifices, and take on risk, all in the name of our collective well-being. I know the grocery store clerks, the truck drivers, farmers, healthcare workers like my wife, and first responders in my district expect their elected leaders to have the same willingness and patriotic duty to make sacrifices just as they do every shift. Americans look to their elected leaders to set an example, and they don't appreciate Congress skipping out on their duties to attend events across their states that seem more desirable than the difficult task of governing during a pandemic. As our country continues to be impacted by the coronavirus, the example I want to set is that we stand side by side with the essential workers of this country. And I don't believe that can be done solely behind a computer screen and over emails. We have debated scenarios like this before, and members who are unable to travel can submit statements to the congressional record. And we have a rule that this majority adopted at the beginning of this Congress that allows for a quorum to be adjusted in an emergency. I will end with a quote from the UK's House of Commons leader, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who recently announced they will be scaling back their virtual parliament. He said, rather than suffering the depredation of a muted hybrid parliament, we are once again talking to each other in ways impossible when we were scattered to the four winds. Rather than wading through the treacle of the hybrid proceedings, we are once again feet afoot and dancing a legislative quick step. And Madam Chair, I'm glad you didn't ask me to dance here, but thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, other members of the committee may have their opening statements included in the record. I'd now like to introduce each member of our panel. Each of our witnesses will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I'll remind our witnesses that their entire written statements will be made part of the record. Also, please note that there should be a timer on your screen. Please be sure that you can see the timer and are mindful of the 5-minute limit. I don't have a heavy gavel, but we do hope to keep within the 5 minutes. So let me introduce our witnesses. First, we have Cheryl Johnson, who is the 36th individual to serve as clerk of the United States House of Representatives. As clerk, Ms. Johnson has a variety of legislative, ceremonial, administrative, and preservation responsibilities. These responsibilities include, but are not limited to, certifying passage of House bills and resolutions, maintaining the electronic voting system, and retaining a permanent set of the books and documents generated by the House. Before being sworn in as clerk in February of 2019, Ms. Johnson worked for nearly 20 years in the House and 10 years at the Smithsonian Institution. Next, we have Representative Newt Gingrich. Mr. Gingrich served as Speaker of the House in the 104th and the 105th Congresses. He was first elected to the House in 1978 and represented Georgia's 6th District from 1979 until 1999. Mr. Gingrich has served as a member of the Defense Policy Board and was a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination during the 2012 election. He has also written 36 books. He serves as a distinguished visiting scholar and professor at the National Defense University. I would note that he is joining us from Rome today, and welcome. I know it's about 7:30 p.m. your time, so we appreciate this. And I just, as a personal note, I would note that my very first day as a member of Congress was the day that you became Speaker of the House. So welcome. It's good to see you again. Bill Crowell is an expert in information technology, security, and intelligence systems. He is the former Deputy Director of the National Security Agency and was appointed to this position after serving as Deputy Director of Operations. After his service at the NSA, Mr. Crowell moved to the private sector and served as CEO of Silent Corporation, a public e-business security solution company, and chairman of Broadware Technologies, a video surveillance software company. He also served as chairman of the Director of National Intelligence Senior Advisory Group from 2017 to 2014, and currently sits on the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Advisory Board. John Green is a vice president and the chief technologist for cybersecurity and government solutions at Aruba Networks, a Hewlett-Packard Enterprise company. In this role, he is responsible for providing technology guidance and leadership for all security solutions, including authentication and network access control, encryption, firewall, and VPN. He works closely with the U.S. government on secure network and remote access solutions and manages both Aruba's product security response team and its threat labs, an internal security research group. Dr. Ron Rivest is an institute professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is widely known as co-author of the textbook Introduction to Algorithms and as co-inventor of the RSA public key crypto system. He's also a co-founder of both RSA and VeriSign. An expert in election security and cryptography, Dr. Rivest is a recipient of the ACM Turing Award, the BBVA Frontiers of Knowledge Award, and the Marconi Prize. He has served on the Election Assistance Commission's Technical Guidelines Development Committee and is a member of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project, as well as the Board of Verified Voting. Dr. Aviel Rubin is a professor of computer science at Johns Hopkins University, where he also serves as technical director of the Information Security Institute. Dr. Rubin is an expert in computer security and applied cryptography, and was among the first to expose the vulnerabilities of electronic voting in his book, Brave New Ballot: The Battle to Safeguard Democracy in the Age of Electronic Voting. Dr. Rubin has briefed Congress and the Department of Defense on election tampering and other national security issues. He served as director and principal investigator for the National Science Foundation's Center for Correct, Usable, Reliable, Auditable, and Transparent Elections, otherwise known as the Accurate Center. Dr. David Wagner is a professor of computer science at UC Berkeley, where he has worked on electronic voting, software security, wireless security, sensor network security, and applied cryptography. He is a part of Berkeley's Security Research Group and is also an active member of the Accurate Center. Dr. Wagner has developed quite a bit of software, including tools to help with the auditing of elections. In addition to his duties as a professor, Dr. Wagner currently sits on the editorial board for the Journal of Election Technology Systems and is part of the Science of Security project. These are distinguished witnesses, and we're eager to hear from them. So I will first recognize Ms. Johnson for your testimony of about 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairperson Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this hearing on such a critical topic. Since 1789, the Office of the Clerk has supported the legislative functions of the U.S. House of Representatives. The clerk maintains the House Journal, certifies the passage of legislation, verifies the accuracy of each individual vote, records the vote, tallies the vote, and transmits the results to the public. After 181 years of manual voting, the House passed the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970, authorizing electronic voting. And while the bill was passed in 1970, it was another 3 years before the system was developed and put into use. That system, the electronic voting system, or EVS, is a real-time computerized information system. EVS resides on its own private air-gapped network, separated from the House network, which affords it a very high level of security. The voting procedures are as follows. Voting stations are distributed throughout the chamber and equipped with a vote card slot, voting buttons, and a system readiness indicator. Each member who chooses to vote electronically does so by inserting a personalized voting card into a voting station and selecting a voting button to cast their vote. Voting results are displayed on screens in the House chamber. In 2018, all the voting stations were upgraded with the latest proximity card reader technology, and new capability to assist visually impaired members. An LED display was added to provide additional vote confirmation to members directly on the vote station. We also implemented a new network architecture for greater security and flexibility for future expansion. I am confident that as the House looks to our office to inform and implement the critical decisions it will make in the coming months and years to preserve and protect the legislative process, we will rise to the occasion. Recently, pursuant to House Resolution 965, the House allowed its first proxy vote. On our website, we post the letters which designate who holds the proxy for the member voting by proxy. Our staff worked long and hard to ensure a successful implementation. To date, we have held 29 votes with proxy without incident. The topic you are discussing today and moving forward is of great importance. However the House decides to proceed on how it conducts voting, our office will be prepared to advise on the associated costs, benefits, and challenges. And we will be prepared to implement whatever decisions are made to ensure the continuity of this irreplaceable institution. If the House chooses to pursue remote voting, we will need to perform an exhaustive review of the requirements, available technology, design options, and once developed, a very thorough testing to ensure its highest level of security, reliability, and availability. It is critical that we ensure complete confidence of the members and the public in the way House votes are recorded. As with the initial development of the EVS, and with each pass upgrade, it will be critical to take the necessary time to implement any remote voting system correctly and securely. The mission of the clerk's office is to support the House in carrying out its legislative responsibilities, and I'm committed to these duties with maximum integrity and reliability. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. It's great to hear from you. Now I'd like to recognize our former speaker, Mr. Gingrich. We're looking forward to hearing your testimony. You may need to unmute. Can somebody unmute Mr. Gingrich?
I think I'm now unmuted.
There you are. We can hear you.
Okay, good.
Very good.
Sorry. Let me just say, first of all, thank you, Chairperson Lofgren, and I want to thank Ranking Member Davis. I served for a decade on the House Administration Committee, so it's kind of fun to be back and be part of this process. I think learning by video is very good and very useful. I think trying to govern by video is a disaster. And the key factor is not going to be all the technology we hear about today. The key factor is how human beings learn and the pattern of the collective dialogue, which makes up a legislative body, and how over time its members become collectively smarter by interacting with each other. The founding fathers were virtually all members of legislatures before they created the United States. And they believed in the legislature. In fact, if you look at the Constitution, the legislative branch is first and has a long section devoted to the House and Senate before they get around to the executive branch. The Federalist Papers make very clear that they thought a legislative parliament meeting on a regular basis was a key to protecting freedom. And the reason they thought that is that they had studied carefully the rise of Cromwell as a dictator during the English Civil War. And they were very frightened that an executive branch that didn't have a vigorous legislative body would always be a danger and a threat to our freedom. So their view was that you had to have people who got together regularly. They had to bond together. They had to be prepared to do things, to learn from each other, to communicate. I remember when I used to be on the House floor, during the course of 1 or 2 votes, you could see 8, 10, 12, 15 different people learn about things all across the country. So I want to emphasize for my part, not the technology. You'll hear a lot about technology today, although with all the various hacking, I'd be worried about it. But I don't worry about technology. I worry about history and the nature of human institutions. And I think they require us to physically be together regularly. I just say that I think there are 3 severe consequences of going to any kind of remote system. The first, as a former speaker who has been accused on occasion of being very powerful, I think when everybody else is out of town, the speaker and their staff become virtually a dictatorship because they have all the power, they have all the ability to deal with the executive branch, to deal with the Senate. And I think it puts the average member at an enormous disadvantage. Second, the individual members are isolated. Oh, they may communicate back and forth, but there's an enormous power biologically in people being physically together. And that's why I want to emphasize, if you study history, going back to the Greeks, the Romans, coming up through the Middle Ages, you'll see why the rise of legislative bodies, whether it was the Roman Senate or it was the British Parliament, why these institutions always involve people coming into a room, meeting with each other, bonding, sharing ideas, and it's a very central thing. I think third, the legislation will be less well thought through. There is an enormous power to the legislative process as it improves, as different members bring in ideas, as different people find things that are wrong. That process really matters. And the legislative product gets to be dramatically better the more there's a systematic legislative process. And I think that the natural pattern of having remote voting will be to dramatically weaken that process. Lastly, I guess I want to challenge what I sense is an absurd level of fear. And because close to the ambassador of the Vatican, I've been living in Rome. We've lived through the pandemic. Italy closed down. There was a crisis comparable to New York City. But I'm very worried by the level of fear that I sense in the United States and this sense of danger. We used to sing, we're the land of the brave and the hope of the free, home of the free. I sense we're beginning to be the land of the timid and the home of the fearful. And I recently wrote Franklin Delano Roosevelt's great admonition that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. I think the idea that politicians are too precious to come together at a time, as you pointed out, Chairperson Lofgren, truck drivers, people who run grocery stores, people who work in restaurants, the number of Americans every day who are going about their business. You can be prudent, you can wear masks, you can have social distancing. But this idea that the current challenge leads us into a radical disruption of 3,000 years of legislative history, I think is a very, very sad commentary on the American system. Politicians are not more important than truck drivers. They're not more important than nurses, or they're not more important than, frankly, people who work in a restaurant or at Walmart or at a grocery store. So I wish you would drop this sense of panic, relax, figure out how to get together in a healthy way, and show the country by example that we can in fact function even under this challenge. Thank you for giving me a couple seconds more than my time.
Thank you, Mr. Gingrich. We'll now hear from Bill Crowell. Mr. Crowell, you are recognized for your testimony. You need to unmute your microphone.
Thank you very much, Chairperson Lofgren. It's a pleasure to be with the committee, and I appreciate the opportunity. My name is Bill Kroll, and I'm testifying today as a private citizen and not on behalf of any entity. I think that it's reasonable to parse the challenges associated with remote voting into 4 major categories. The first, video conferencing systems with the right functionality and security. The second, voting systems with verification of the identity of the members and of their votes, and with the functionality required to carry out your legal obligations. Technical issues such as connectivity, operating capacity, certification of the security of the system, and secure end-to-end encryption, multi-factor authentication, and secure storage of all relevant documents and records is the third item. And the last is adequate funding to acquire, maintain, and operate and certify the systems. There are many video conferencing systems. They vary widely in their features and functions, as well as the level of security. Only a few have end-to-end encryption, and none are certified for classified information unless operated in a secure facility. Many of them were either developed outside the United States or have considerable operating support coming from outside the United States, which raises extra concerns about their security and their reliability. Also, since COVID-19 has significantly increased the use of video conferencing, a number of these systems have been subjected to successful cyber attacks, underscoring the lack of cyber resilience of this method of staying connected. With regard to voting systems during the COVID-19 pandemic, at least 24 state legislative bodies have embraced various approaches to both remote voting and remote hearings. No common approaches or standards have been adopted, although there's been wide use of a number of video conferencing systems as a means of conducting remote hearings and the use of video streaming over the internet to provide for public participation and transparency. A wide variety of techniques have been used as voting platforms. It's my belief that the most attractive solution for remote voting is a purpose-built software package that incorporates all the attributes associated with congressional process, including committee management, remote hearings, document and bill markup, archiving, public access to the proceedings, and recorded votes, and of course, an easy-to-use remote voting process. There are several technical issues that also can limit or interfere with the success of a remote voting system. First on that list is the fact that members and staff do not use the same devices, either in their districts or on the road. In addition, the internet service providers in their districts provide differing levels of performance. Security issues are the most prevalent and pervasive technical issue in this digital age. Specifically, multi-factor authentication, end-to-end encryption, and verification or audit of all the votes, documents, and proceedings must not only be present in the solution, but be accredited or certified to work as specified. Today, cyber attacks are an hourly and daily fact, and many of them are successful against well-designed but flawed product implementation or use. These attacks have been commonplace. They're carried out by nation states, criminals, activists, as well as hackers just seeking the thrill of a successful attack. A remote voting system must be resilient against all of these bad actors, particularly nation states who are seeking to disrupt our democratic processes. Last but not least are the four categories of providing sufficient funding to acquire and certify such systems. In conclusion, I believe there are many factors that can impede successful deployment and operation of a remote voting solution in the House. But I also think that many of these can be mitigated. I hope that my parsing of this problem is useful and your framing of an approach that maximizes functionality needed to make this effort successful. And thank you very much for the opportunity to provide a perspective on this important topic. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. I'll now recognize Mr. Green for his testimony. Mr. Green, you are welcome to testify.
Thank you. Chairperson Lofgren and Ranking Member Davis and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today as you explore the feasibility and security of remote voting for House members. While recognizing that this institution is founded on in-person engagement and voting requirements, the current pandemic has made it entirely reasonable to consider technology that allows for secure remote voting. I've spent the past 17 years working for Aruba, a part of Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, and for the past 10 years, I've worked closely with our US and allied partner government customers on secure network and remote access solutions. I hope that experience will help provide relevant information on today's topic. Before beginning my formal testimony, I want to thank Chairperson Lofgren for her representation of San Jose and Silicon Valley over the past 25 years. HPE and the larger technology community in the Valley are grateful for her consistent support and leadership. Let me assure you that you are not alone in trying to adapt to the new world of work from home orders. Since this pandemic began, we've received thousands of inquiries from our enterprise customers seeking solutions to enable secure remote working. It's fair to say that very few of them envisioned a world where 100% of their workforce would suddenly be working from home. Such widespread remote working brings with it additional challenges. End users without the benefit of on-site IT support personnel often become frustrated when their technology doesn't work correctly. And without protections provided by IT security solutions, users often turn to that which is convenient, such as personal email accounts, rather than that which is secure. The stakes are very high when it comes to remote voting in the House, so it's critical to provide members a solution that is both convenient and secure. In the world of information security, we often speak of the CIA triad. Not to be confused with the intelligence agency, CIA stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the three most important aspects of a secure system. Many people equate security with confidentiality, but in remote voting, the most important principle is actually integrity, the guarantee that information is trustworthy, consistent, accurate, and originated from the correct person. Second in importance is availability. A member must be able to cast a vote during the period that voting is open. We've all seen the reports documenting foreign adversary interference in US public elections, and we can't for a minute believe that adversaries would not also try to interfere in congressional voting. For that reason, it's imperative that the House implement the highest degree of security possible. Fortunately, a model already exists for highly secure remote access. Congress does not have to go first. 10 years ago, the National Security Agency introduced a program known as Commercial Solutions for Classified, which has been widely adopted by the DoD, the intelligence community, law enforcement, and others to connect classified systems and devices over untrusted networks using commercial off-the-shelf IT products. This same architecture has been also deployed for unclassified systems when organizations have needed to adopt the best security available. Congress can dispense with months of security analysis by adopting an existing proven architecture. Overall, I believe we need to focus on 4 key principles to ensure a successful remote voting program. First, as previously mentioned, secure remote network connectivity should be provided following the NSA Commercial Solutions for Classified architecture. This ensures that members of Congress are not connecting directly to malicious or compromised networks. Second, dedicated voting devices should be issued to each member to be used only for the purpose of voting. These could take the form of laptops, tablets, or smartphones with a simple application showing buttons labeled yes, no, and present. Third, multi-factor authentication would be mandatory for such a solution. It is critical to ensure that the member, and only the member, is the person casting a vote. Multi-factor authentication is already widely used by the federal government and is a well-understood technology. And fourth, a manual system of vote verification is required. The member needs a way to verify that the correct vote was registered in real time in a system that is visible to all. This could be as simple as monitoring the vote on C-SPAN. My remaining caution to you is to focus on availability. We can solve for integrity and confidentiality, but availability is often overlooked. Systems deployed today that use the public internet rely on users being lost in a crowd, their internet traffic appearing indistinguishable from others. If an adversary were able to pinpoint the internet location of each congressional member, then targeted denial of service attacks could prevent specific members from casting their votes. To counter this threat, backup systems of voting must remain available, and time limits on voting windows may need to be relaxed. As skilled as we are today at engineering reliable networks, the best backup systems are often low tech. In summary, I believe that should you decide to move forward, remote voting is technically feasible, can be enabled for a reasonable cost, and can be done with an appropriately high level of security. Thank you again for the opportunity to offer testimony. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much for that interesting testimony. Dr. Rivest, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Thank you. Chairperson Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee. My name is Ron Rivest. I thank you for inviting me to testify regarding the feasibility of using technology for conducting remote voting in the House. My bottom line is that such remote voting is feasible, can be made adequately secure. I'll skip a few paragraphs of my testimony since my bio has already been read. I just note that I've worked for over 2 decades on voting system security. And I speak here only about the security aspects of remote voting, not about the appropriateness of remote voting for the House. That question is beyond my pay grade. I see that the House, under Resolution 965, is already using proxy voting for remote voting. That resolution authorizes examination of ways to vote remotely in a secure manner, hence today's hearing. As noted, I think the House is in a good position. There are indeed suitable secure voting technologies available. The most important reason why that is true is that the House votes are not secret. Voting in the House is not based on secret ballots. That makes all the difference, as manipulation or alteration of votes can be detected and corrected. For the record, I note that in the US, secret ballot voting was first implemented in Massachusetts in 1888. However, implementing secure secret ballot remote voting is still beyond the state of the art. Back to non-secret voting. Designing a secure voting system requires, first of all, a clear statement of the security objectives. The system can't be said to be secure if there is no specification of what security should mean for that system. What are the baseline voting system security requirements? Here are 4. Only eligible voters can vote, and each at most once. Votes are cast as intended. Votes are collected as cast. And votes are counted as collected. Each property should not only be true, but be verifiably true. Counting, as noted, tabulation is not an issue, since non-secret ballots can be posted publicly and the tally then verified by anyone. One recommended principle for achieving voting system security is that of software independence, a notion developed by John Wack of NIST and myself. This principle basically says that you never want to be in a position where you have to say, well, the result must be right because the computer says so. In other words, the election outcomes must be auditable. Here is a sketch of a simple architectural approach for secure remote non-secret voting to illustrate. There's a public website where all cast votes are posted. Each congressperson composes his or her vote, digitally signs it, and sends the resulting digitally signed ballot for posting on the public website. Many digital signature schemes are available. NIST has developed digital signature standards. Digital signatures are now implemented in every browser. One approach uses the RSA public key crypto system. A nice thing about digital signatures is that the signature on a digitally signed document, such as a ballot, is verifiable by anyone. I note that a digital signature is not just a cut and paste image of a handwritten signature. It is a mathematical function of the message being signed and secret information specific to the signer. Digitally signed ballots can be authenticated using public information, both as to the origin, who the voter is, and as to the content, what the ballot says. Vote manipulations are not possible, as forging digital signatures is not feasible. The most an adversary can do is to delete or duplicate votes. An adversary can conceivably delete or duplicate votes even now with proxy voting. If a congressperson can't submit a ballot, they can't vote. Detection and correction mechanisms can work for voting with digitally signed ballots much as they work for proxy ballot voting. It is important to note that voters, in this case congresspeople, can check or audit their votes as correctly recorded on the public website. Missing votes can be restored. This should be checked. This is important. An approach sketched here bears many similarities to your current proxy voting procedures. The public website becomes the proxy for those voting remotely. Indeed, such a system should provide a smooth and secure extension of your current proxy voting procedures, which need not be abandoned. This sketch is intended only to show that it is possible to use technology to do remote, non-secret voting in a secure manner. Many other approaches are possible. This concludes my testimony. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very, very much. I'd now like to ask Dr. Rubin to give us his testimony.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairperson Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, or I should actually say for some of you, it's good morning, right? And members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to participate in today's hearing. My name is Avi Rubin, and I'm a professor of computer science at Johns Hopkins University. I'm also technical director of our Information Security Institute. I've held these positions for the last 17 years, and prior to that, I was a cybersecurity researcher for 9 years at AT&T Labs in Belcourt. For 10 years, my research focused on election security, and I was director of the National Science Foundation Accurate Center for Secure Elections. I was also an election judge in Maryland, and I worked 6 elections as an election judge. I've been asked to comment on the technical feasibility of building a system for House members to vote remotely. I will not be addressing the political question of whether the House should employ it, just focusing on technical issues relating to feasibility and security. Remote voting for House members is very different from remote internet voting where citizens elect their political leaders, which I strongly oppose for security reasons. What makes internet voting difficult is the secret ballot requirement. The House members' votes are not anonymous, and that makes all of the difference. I consider important features of a system for remote voting by House members. The features are that the votes are cast over the internet on a mobile device or computer or even a dedicated device. The votes are displayed as they are cast on a virtual board, simulating the large board in the House chamber that shows the votes. The public has access to the virtual board and can see how members voted. And the system needs to work in real time because some procedural votes lead to activity based on the results of those votes right away. So a system that detects errors days later would not be that useful. Without the secrecy requirement, I believe that it is possible to design, build, and deploy a reasonably safe and secure remote voting capability for House members that meets these requirements, provided that certain procedures are followed. When considering the security of a system, the first step is to develop a threat model. Next, you want to rank the threats in order of severity, and then security designers will attempt to address those threats. For House members to vote remotely, here are examples of some of the threats. One would be an attacker compromising a member's device, whether it's a phone or a tablet or a computer, and forging votes on behalf of that member. Another threat might be that an attacker forges votes for a member without even compromising their device. Let's look at another threat. An attacker could compromise a backend system and cause the votes to be tabulated incorrectly. And finally, a targeted denial of service attack, which was already mentioned, against a member's network right when they are trying to vote that prevents them from being able to vote. Well, against the forged votes and the disruption of the tallies, we can address those with standard security practices. These can include encrypted and authenticated communication lines, multi-factor authentication, and audits and checks. For example, imagine that a staffer for a member registers their mobile device with the system, and then whenever the staffer votes, whenever the member votes, that staffer receives a notification on their phone saying the member has voted and here's how they voted. And that would be one check to make sure that the votes were being cast the way that the staffer knew that the member would cast the votes. There are many other such safeguards that a designer of a system could put into place. Now, addressing the denial of service attacks is more challenging, but this can be addressed with backup communication capabilities, including voice calls, and in the worst case, alarms can be raised. The key is that any security issues can be detected and addressed in a system such as this. So in conclusion, technology is available today to make it possible for members to vote on bills remotely over the internet. However, care must be taken to employ proper security design, procedures, and audit to ensure that tampering is not occurring, and backup procedures should be considered in the event that the system is unavailable at a critical time. So I'm happy to answer any questions during the QA portion of the hearing, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our last testimony will be from Dr. Wagner. We're eager to hear your comments.
Chairperson Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and committee members, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this hearing today. I'm a professor of computer science at the University of California, Berkeley. I've published more than 100 peer-reviewed scientific papers on computer security, and I've worked on the security of elections for over 15 years. I have one message for you today. It is technologically feasible for the House to vote remotely if you decide that voting remotely is in the public interest. There are risks, but my assessment is that the technical risks can be mitigated. If members of the House can vote on bills over the internet, a natural concern is that hackers might attack your computers and try to tamper with the votes. Another concern is that technical issues might prevent members from casting their vote or cause votes to be recorded inaccurately. These are serious risks, but I believe these risks can be addressed through a combination of people, process, and technology. I'd like to walk you through 3 possible models you could consider for remote voting. One way you could vote online would be for the House to develop its own app. You've heard how this could work. Each member could cast their vote from an app on their phone with a public vote board showing the votes received in real time. I'd suggest that each member have one of their staff cross-check that the vote was recorded correctly. Maybe party whips could help with that too. And I discuss in my written statement some security measures that I think would be appropriate for this approach. The primary disadvantage of developing your own app is that it might take many months or even years to develop and deploy your own solution. A second option would be to buy a commercially available system for voting online. A third option would be to use remote video conferencing. To record their vote, a member could make a video call to the office of the clerk, and the clerk's staff could verify the member's face and voice and record their vote. I outline in my written statement ways that you could harden this approach against hacking. The primary advantage of a video conferencing approach is that it could be deployed rapidly using existing tools. Regardless of which model you adopt, I would like to propose 4 principles that I think would support security for voting in the House. First, I suggest that you provide a way for members to check that their votes were recorded correctly, and you encourage everyone to do this. This provides a powerful backstop in the event of technical problems. If you make it easy for members and their staff to verify that their vote was recorded correctly, then any technical issues or hacking can be detected and corrected. Any system can potentially be hacked, but well-designed ones anticipate this and provide a way to detect it and correct the problem. Second, I think it will be important to consider the policies and processes that govern remote voting. You might consider how members can report any discrepancies in how their vote was recorded and have them corrected. You might also consider what fallback procedures will be available if a member is unable to vote due to technical issues and the timeline for doing so. Third, you might consider selecting a partner with cybersecurity expertise. When you buy a house, you hire a professional inspector to check for any problems. And the same applies here. It might be helpful to have security experts on tap to help. And there are a number of government organizations that might be available to help with that. Fourth, I suggest following good cybersecurity practices, such as use of two-factor authentication, end-to-end encryption, and providing members with hardened devices to vote from. In summary, I believe technology can enable the House to vote remotely in a reasonably safe way if you decide that it would be appropriate to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wagner, and thanks to all of the witnesses for their very informative testimony. We now have an opportunity, each of us members, to ask questions of our witnesses for 5 minutes. I would note that Mr. Gingrich has previously advised us that he has a hard stop in about 25 minutes. So I just wanted members to know that if they have questions for Mr. Gingrich.
Well, actually, Chairperson, this is so interesting. I'll stay. I'll just.
Okay, good. Very
All right.
good. Very
Thank
good.
you.
I'm going to turn to the ranking member first to recognize him for his 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson, and thank you to all the witnesses. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about technology and talk about the overall process of remote voting possibly existing in the House. But Mr. Speaker, you touched on this in your testimony, but can you elaborate further on how you see remote voting as possibly centralizing power in the Speaker's office?
I'd be glad to. And let me say, I was very impressed with the witnesses, and I have no doubt that if the House decides it's wise, that you can develop a very solid system. And I concur with Clerk Cheryl Johnson that she could easily, I think, develop and guarantee the integrity of that kind of a system. So I think that's an important frame of this. The challenge you have is basically how humans operate. as you know, you build teams by being together long enough to know each other. You build teams by working out and solving problems together. I think you have to look at not just the first week or the first month, but if you start down a road where you're saying that being distant, not interacting biologically in the same room, is an acceptable pattern, then I think you begin to set up a post-legislative body that is something we've never seen before. Legislative bodies historically aren't just about voting. They're about building a collective understanding and a collective knowledge, and at times, in taking on presidents or taking on kings, they're about people who know each other well enough to have courage in situations of enormous danger. So as a historian, I worry about the wisdom half of this. As a citizen, I have no doubt, if you decide it's the way to go, you have brilliant people today who are testifying, and collectively they could produce a state. They can guarantee the technology, but I'm not sure they can guarantee the historical and sociological side effects.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with you. I mean, we're the United States of America. If there's anything that needs to be built in this globe, we can make sure that happens. And the great people who are here today likely could do that. But I agree with you. I still believe it impacts what Congress looks like over the next generation. Matter of fact, I'm on the committee to modernize Congress, select committee to modernize Congress. Many of our recommendations have been built around we ought to get together more, talk more. That's how we begin to legislate. But another important process is oversight. Now, you changed the oversight process within the House when you got rid of proxy voting at the committee that the committee chairs had before you were Speaker. Did that empower more member input? And what kind of oversight, what kind of oversight issues do you think remote voting would give to the legislative branch when dealing with the executive branch?
Look, I think oversight is unbelievably important. I don't think we do enough of it, and I don't think we develop enough expertise in it. And again, I would just say, a lot of these topics, whether it's healthcare or national security or you name it, they require years of learning. Members who spend years working on a particular area very often know more than the executive branch people that they're interrogating. So I think it's very important. We eliminated proxy voting because what was happening was the chairman would walk in and they would have 15 votes in their pocket. Now, those people didn't sit through the hearing. They didn't ask any questions. But when the time came to vote, even if you'd had all your people there on some of these committees where they were stacked pretty intensely, the chairman just won. There was almost no reason to go. So that was a big factor in why we went there. I think our hope was that it would get more member involvement, more member engagement, and more member learning. And as a result, all 435 players could be involved, not just a handful. That was our hope anyway.
We appreciate you doing that. I do believe it's made the House work better. We do, as I know the members of this committee have tremendous input. And I also want to thank you for the transformation that you made to the House when you took over as Speaker, to move the House from a patronage machine of decades before to a more professional organization with our Chief Administrative Officer, and making sure that politics was put out of that process as much as possible in a political house that we work in. So I appreciate your experience, appreciate your comments, and I'll go ahead and yield back. And thanks for taking the time today.
Gentleman yields back. I would now turn to the other Davis on our committee, the gentlelady from California, Susan Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate all of our witnesses here today. And I wanted to start with Clerk Johnson, if I might. And Clerk Johnson, I especially wanted to thank you for everything that you and your staff have been doing to make voting and legislative processes possible during this difficult time of the pandemic. And we need to remember, we're in a national emergency here. We're not just talking about this because we think that, maybe some people would like to do it this way. There's a reason for that. And it's a matter of life and death. And for some of our families, quite honestly, it is a matter of life and death. So being safe is very, very important. I wanted to just acknowledge that your effort, Clerk Johnson, to make Congress work remotely requires remote voting, of course, that we've been talking about, but also remote legislative processes, including bill introduction and co-sponsorship. And I know that you've worked hard on that, creating electronic signatures. I want to thank you as well for setting up the email system for bills and sponsorships, and hope we can continue to work together on that. And you've also been active in setting up some of the small group voting and proxy voting that is also smart and safe for all of us. I'm sure you know, and probably the one issue that members would talk about that is a concern of theirs, especially when they are there and voting right now, again, because of COVID, is being able to vote quickly, get on and off the floor, and perhaps find ways of saving time in between. And I wonder whether you think that there are some more efficient ways of doing that. I want to turn to the clerk for that.
Clerk needs to unmute her microphone before she answers.
Yes.
Thank you.
And looking at the process that's currently in place, I certainly think it's very efficient. With the proxy voting, members are able to come in, and if they are holding proxies for other members, they announce those proxies on the floor. At the same time, the tally clerk holds a binder that has a copy of the proxies to make certain that it is reliable and transparent. And members are able to move on and off of the floor very, very efficiently. A vote normally takes about 45 minutes because they are sequential. Members come in probably 15 at a time. They exercise social distancing. And as I said, we have not had any incidents to date.
If I may, just quickly, I think the timing in between the votes and for some of us walking back and forth to offices, it's great. We get more steps in, I guess you could say that. But I also just wanted to see that if there are some ways that people have suggested shortening some of the time, and maybe that's something that we can all continue to talk about. But I know that that is the concern that people have expressed, because it kind of forces people to hang out a little bit, and that's not something that we know is necessarily in the best interest of all of us doing that and keeping people safe. I wanted to turn quickly because several of our speakers have talked about this, and I think it's really an interesting concept. And you know, how could remote voting be corrupted, given that it's not a secret ballot? And I know that Dr. Rubin has talked about that, Dr. Rivest as well. I wonder if you could, I mean, it is, you know, are we talking about corruption here? Or is it that we want to be sure that members have the ability very, very quickly to be able to check and see if their votes are correct? Great, it's not a secret system. So the whole world should be able to watch this with us and to be sure that we're correct, and ask others on the panel to respond to that. Dr. Rivest?
Well, I would just
I'd be happy to speak to that. Sure. Yes, you're absolutely right. You hit the nail on the head with a key requirement, which is that voters need to be, the Congress people who are voting need to be able to check that their ballot is correctly recorded and posted. There may be corruption on the way between inside the voter's mobile device and their laptop, whatever they're using. There may be corruption on the route to the posting, but any of those things can be detected and corrected as long as there's a way for the voter to check that the vote was received as intended and posted correctly. So I think that's exactly right. There are possibilities for corruption, but as long as you have a detection and correction mechanism, such as you've talked about here, such as we've all talked about, this can work well.
Thank you.
Mr. Crowell, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that list disruption, which I think is a very big issue and will have to be addressed, as Dr. Rivest and Dr. Rubin mentioned earlier. Disruption is occurring all the time in the internet, and we have to deal with.
Very good. Thank you so much. I'd now like to turn to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker, for his questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Speaker Gingrich, you touched on how working together and hearing different perspectives will be greatly diminished with members not physically being in DC. I know some of my personal work has been bipartisan. Some of those relationships with some of the development on policies, those conversations happen on the House floor. I can think of two instances during a motion to recommit where colleagues of mine did change their votes going onto the floor after hearing the debate. In fact, there's a verse in Proverbs in the original Hebrew that states, "The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes along and examines him." I don't look at this as a technological debate. I look at this as a procedural debate, a historical debate, a debate of what is best for the American people. Would you mind expanding on how this remote control or remote voting will have a potential corrosive impact on the legislative process?
Thank you for that question, Congressman Walker. Look, I approach this from two different perspectives. One is somebody who did serve 20 years in the House. And for example, when I was Speaker, most of our major bills had huge bipartisan majorities. And they did so because we listened to each other. And on occasion, we got into fights. We had one effort to reform welfare that got vetoed. We had to sit back down, talk it through. By the time we were done, literally half the Democrats voted with us. It was 101 to 101 in the caucus. And that wouldn't have happened if we weren't able to listen to each other. I can also tell you that I'm a big fan of congressional delegation trips because you get away from your staff, you get away from your constituents, you get away from lobbyists. You are with the other members for 3, 4, 5, 6 days, learning together, experiencing together, talking together. So one is my own personal experience biologically having done it. The other is my experience as a historian, that when you study all of these great demands that involve freedom, if you look at the proceedings leading up to the English Civil War, where the Parliament organizes itself against King Charles I. If you look at the rebellion ultimately against Cromwell, who had become a dictator at the end of that Civil War. If you look at why the Founding Fathers, remember all these Founding Fathers were professional politicians. They'd all served in legislatures. They were colonial legislatures, but they were real. And they'd all negotiated. And so they believed that the legislative branch was so important that they made it the #1 thing in the Constitution. But in their experience, the legislative branch, for example, for Washington and others, meant you rode down to Williamsburg. You were there for 6 or 8 weeks. You stayed together, you ate together, you talked together. Constitutional Convention, 55 days without a break, all of it in secret. Talking together, worrying, negotiating, thinking, finally at one point having a day of prayer because they'd gotten deadlocked. I think humans learn from each other. And when you start trying to replace humans with a mechanical interface or an electronic interface, you rapidly degrade the long-term wisdom of the collective group.
I certainly agree. All over the country right now, we are trying to bring people together. In a couple of weeks, we will have 200 pastors coming together from all of our communities to begin conversations to talk about how to resolve issues. It would be impossible to do that in a remote. There's also another aspect of this. What kind of message does this send to the American people when members of Congress can just stay at home and push a button or call in or video conference while our other essential workers are still showing up? My wife is a trauma 1 nurse specialist practitioner. She has to show up every day. Would you address that as well?
I am deeply concerned by the level of panic that the American news media has created. I don't see it here in Europe. I don't see it anywhere else around the world. And I think that it is almost entirely media driven. Yes, this is a problem, but we've dealt with a lot of other health problems before. And I think that we can deal with this one. And I think as a populist, as somebody whose father served 27 years in the Army and came out with no money, look, I find the idea of the political class being too precious to take the risk of getting together. I find that goes against everything in the American system And I find it deeply offensive to think that the politicians think that they are more valuable than a truck driver or a worker at In-N-Out in Los Angeles.
Thank you. Right on the time. 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to see you today. I yield back.
At this point, I would like to recognize the other gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield, for his questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and it's good to see all of my colleagues today. I hope and pray that all of you are well. Let me also thank our witnesses for your testimony. I've been listening very carefully, Madam Chair, to the various witnesses today, and I was really struck when Mr. Gingrich suggested that we are acting in a sense of panic that the news media has created. And I want to respectfully dispute that premise. I suggest today that Democrats are engaged in what I would like to call strategic planning. That is to protect this institution if rates of infection continue to increase. Protecting the members if assembling on the floor is infectious, that is our goal. It is not to create any panic, it is simply to protect the members if assembling on the House floor becomes infectious. I will note that there was a press conference last week in front of the Capitol, and one of our beloved members from Virginia contracted the coronavirus while right here on the Capitol grounds. And so we're just trying to be proactive and to look forward and to do some strategic planning. I was in a meeting the other day, a virtual meeting with two of the leading epidemiologists in the world. And what those two gentlemen told us was that COVID is winning. COVID is winning. If states don't require extraordinary measures, the infection rates could reach as much as 50% by the end of the year. I hope my colleagues are not surprised by that. I hope you agree with that assessment. But if the rates of infection continue on the same course that we are seeing now, it could rise to 50% this year. And so, as my colleague Susan Davis said a moment ago, this is a national emergency. And it could be a matter of life and death. Let me just turn my first question to the clerk, and thank you, Ms. Johnson, for your incredible work and all that you do for all of us in the House. At one given time, under normal circumstances, Ms. Johnson, how many people are on the floor? And that would be members and member staff and the support personnel, including the Capitol Police and the Sergeant at Arms and the personnel from your office. Collectively, how many people under normal conditions are on the floor?
Approximately 20 persons, and that's clerk staff as well as the staff of the parliamentarian and speakers leadership staff as well, both Democrat and Republican. But with the clerk's office, we have the bill clerk, the reading clerk,
but put it all together, including the members, including the Capitol Police, in the aggregate, how many people? 500 perhaps?
Oh, if we include everyone on the floor at one time, it's well over 500. It's probably more like 550.
And so while I think it's wonderful to have 500 people on the floor so that we can talk with each other and plan our votes in the middle of a motion to recommit and all of that. I think we have to look at extraordinary circumstances. We do not need 500 people on the floor at one time. We don't need 50 people on the floor at one time. And so thank you for that. It occurs to me that one of the most straightforward ways to vote remotely might be to do it by video conference. In which the member would simply tell a vote clerk how they wish to vote. I know our friends over in the other body, they vote by a roll call, but it's an in-person roll call. And I'm thinking perhaps about an electronic teleconference roll call. Would that be practical?
It would be technically feasible. We would just have to make certain that it is reliable, but it certainly would be practical.
And finally, in a remote voting scenario, do you think it would be beneficial to have votes to be public the moment the votes are cast? And as we all know, the public does not know how we vote instantaneously. The members know because we can look up at the board, but the public does not know for a few minutes until your office is able to post it on the internet. But do you have a system in mind whereby the public would immediately know how a member of Congress voted on legislation?
I think that involves variables. I don't have a system in mind, but we could probably have such a system. But no, I don't have one in mind.
But that would be beneficial, I take it, if the public could instantly know how a member voted.
Transparency is always beneficial.
Thank you, Madam.
I agree.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Thank you, Madam Speaker, Madam Chairman. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to turn to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, for his questions.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. I apologize for my voice. Believe it or not, there are other sicknesses other than COVID out there. And I came down with the good old common cold.
Oh, I'm sorry.
This week, and I totally lost my voice yesterday, but it's coming back. It isn't COVID because of a flight I took on Air Force One a few days ago. I was tested. And so I know that, and that kind of plays into, I think, what Speaker Gingrich was talking about is it's almost like today, if anybody gets a cold, they're all of a sudden just scared to death if they have COVID. And so we have to keep things in perspective. I think the question that we should be asking here today, and several of our witnesses have alluded to this, the question isn't whether or not this could technically be done, is it whether we should be doing this? And I think one key indicator to whether we should be doing this or not is the amount of time that we've talked about security on here today. That ought to be the first indicator that ought to raise a red flag. I spent 30 years in the technology sector. And one of the things I can tell you, there's an old adage that basically said, the question isn't if you're going to be hacked, but it's when. And I know that we can build systems that will be secure enough to do this, but also those systems are only as good as you maintain them continually. And it would create an inordinate amount of work to continue to maintain these, because as some of our esteemed panelists have said today, they've talked about how high profile this would be, what a target we would be, the risk that we would have. And obviously, we would be one of the highest profile targets, not only to cyber criminals, but to foreign entities as well. And the amount of effort that we would spend in just continuing to stay ahead of the bad guys, I don't know that it would be worth implementing a system like this. I think we really should be talking about ways to hold ourselves accountable to do the jobs we're supposed to be doing. I can't remember, I'm sure Speaker Gingrich can tell us, when was the last time that the House and the Senate actually passed appropriations by our own deadline? I mean, I think we should spend time on how we hold ourselves to do our jobs, not trying to make it easier for us not to do our jobs. But I think it is important to have the conversation, but the most secure way to vote is to walk on the floor with your card. And I give credit to the system that we have right now. It does take longer. It isn't as efficient because we can't go on the floor and vote on 4 votes at one time. It takes, half a day or a quarter of a day to vote on one bill because of the procedure votes. But yet we've got it down to where we can do that. So anyhow, I think the real question ought to be, is this something we should be considering, not if it could be done? Speaker Gingrich, good to see you again. And it took me a moment when you said you were in Rome. I had to figure out, were you talking about Rome, Georgia, or Rome, Italy? So I think I figured that out. But you did a lot to reform House processes. I've read several books on it. When you became Speaker, it was like reforming the entire House because of the level of corruption that existed at several levels, and including at the time of the House Administration Committee. And one of the things that's been spoke about is that you got rid of proxy voting. Why did you get rid of that in the committee level, and what were the problems that created?
Well, let me say first, just for a second, that in terms of what Clerk Johnson is dealing with, we actually brought in a firm to audit the House. And after about 9 months, they came back and briefed us and said, it's impossible. That since 1789, the House has never kept records accurate enough to be audited. But they said, if you'll give us a contract a year from now, we'll be able to audit the House. And that was one of the breakthrough moments that led to a much more modern House. And the corruption wasn't particularly partisan. It was just people gotten sloppy over a very, very long period. I would say, and I draw a distinction here. As I said earlier, I have no doubt with the experts you've heard from today that you can get to a safe and secure method for remote voting. The proxy voting issue is a different issue and one which does concern me, and that is it centralizes power and actually lowers the interest of other members in participating because they're just going to lose the vote. And the chairman of the committee or the speaker of the House or whoever is just going to beat them with the names of people who aren't even there, have no idea how it's been voted. And so that, for us, that was a very frustrating part of being in the minority. And that's why we changed it when we took over. We actually took away from our brand new chairman the power that their predecessors had and would not let our new chairman use the proxies to dominate their committees.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, there are times that it would be beneficial when I have 3 committee hearings going on at the same time or markups, and I have to run from one to the other, but that's just part of what I signed up to do. So thank you. I see I'm out of time and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Raskin has been able to join us from the Rules Committee. We thank you. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for his 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, thank you very much, and thanks for calling this extremely important meeting at a time when the country is in an intensifying crisis with the coronavirus. We have 3.3 million cases. We lead the world in case count. We lead the world in death count. We have tens of millions of people thrown out of work because of this nightmare. And several of our states would be in the top 5 countries in the world in terms of increases in the coronavirus if they were treated as a country. And we know that there are hospitals being maxed out and overrun in Florida, in Texas, in Arizona, and throughout a lot of the southern part of our country. I would not agree with the proposition that that using remote voting or proxy voting in the context of a national public health crisis reduces deliberation. I would think that people can engage in robotic, cultish, party line voting even when they're standing on the floor of the House. And I've seen many, many people do that. And I think people at the same time could call in a proxy vote or vote remotely, having listened carefully to the speeches on TV and having consulted with their colleagues. So I just think that that argument has very little force to it. There might be other things we can do to promote meaningful dialogue and discussion, but I understand the same kinds of arguments were made when the House of Representatives first moved to use electronic voting in the first place. That somehow this would sterilize the process and cut down on interpersonal communication and so on. So I'm more concerned about the argument that I've heard from several people today, phrased rhetorically, what kind of message does it send to Americans on the front lines, like nurses and doctors and first responders who go to work if there are members of the House who can't make it and they vote from home? Does it say something, as Mr. Gingrich said, and I'm sorry I never had the chance to serve in Congress with Congressman Gingrich because he's an interesting guy, but does it say something about the preciousness of the political class? Well, I don't think so. If anyone wants to really prove his manhood in this process or prove your courage or your tenacity, go spend a day in a hospital with the nurses and the doctors and the frontline providers. And if you can't do that or you don't want to do that, listen to them because they're all telling us the same thing. Stay home because the hospitals are being overrun and the pandemic is out of control. And we have people like the president who are not wearing masks. And we have people who are undermining the public health advice of our doctors and our scientists and Dr. Fauci. Stay home if you can stay home because this virus is still out of control. Now, the House of Representatives, as I think I heard the clerk testify, when we're operating and there's a vote going on, can have anywhere between 400, 500, 550 people together on the floor. My friends, conferences across the country have been canceled during this period because they have 500 people coming together at hotels. And that's how the virus is spread in a number of cases, one infamously in Boston at a conference where it just spread like wildfire. We basically are a regular meeting conference in that sense, when you look at it from an epidemiological perspective. So nobody wants to be in this position. And this is not the occasion to discuss the incompetence of the national government's response to this crisis. Nobody wants to be in this situation, but we do have a responsibility to maintain the continuity of government and the continuity of Congress, and to make sure that we are acting consistent with public health protocols in a safe and in a secure way. And so I very much favor the idea of moving forward. You know, Madam Chair, if you permit me one more thought, there were people saying, well, this isn't fair to our constituents when we were talking about proxy voting. Proxy voting has allowed lots of members who were sick, and we've had a number of members, both Republicans and Democrats, suffer from the coronavirus. We've enabled people to participate. We've enabled them to participate if they have immunocompromised or vulnerable family members, or other people who couldn't go because of travel logistics and couldn't make it to Washington. Their constituents had a voice. And I know because the Republicans are suing about this, a lot of Republicans didn't participate. I think in the last vote, there were 9 or 10 Republicans who didn't participate. What does it say to their constituents that they would prefer to make some kind of vain moral gesture by not voting and not having their own constituents represented than to participate in a system which allows everyone to be heard? I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I'd now like to turn to the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Fudge, for her 5 minutes of questioning. Is Marcia still with us? Perhaps not, then we'll go to Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and appreciate the panel and the panelists for being here. Just off of what Mr. Raskin mentioned too, one of the other roles I play is Chief Deputy Whip of our caucus, and I have a number of conversations with colleagues about it, just like you, Madam Chair, and no colleague is in the same position. Some colleagues live with someone who has autoimmune issues. Some live with in-laws or spend time with family members who have compromised systems. We all have to make decisions based on our own personal health and circumstances. This isn't anything that has to do with how the press is portraying it. This has to do about public health. This has to do about the real risks that exist by members getting on planes and coming from all points in the country. We don't all live in Washington, D.C. I know maybe in another time that was more prevalent. That has been weaponized by politics in the past. And so many of us, and I among them, I've been to every boat that we've made during the pandemic. I'll board a plane and spend 5 hours each way doing that. And having a commute that's over 8 hours each way. And there's no problem with that. That's what I signed up for, as my colleague from Georgia mentioned. But let's not minimize the fact that every member is going to make the decisions that's best for them. And I'd like to just bring it back briefly to the topic of the hearing isn't about our hopes and fears, isn't about the press. It's about exploring the feasibility and security of the technology that's at hand. And so I'd like to ask Mr. Green, is there a technology in existence in the commercial market space that could be useful to the House in creating a secure infrastructure to implement remote voting?
Yeah, I don't want to self-promote too much, but of course my own company produces something like that that's used widely for secure remote access, and that's just that's a piece of an overall solution. That's not a complete solution. So we focus on the network, and there are other tech companies that focus on secure network connectivity as well. On top of that, you can layer very standard types of technologies, whether that's browser-based applications. A voting application could be as simple as a web server and a browser running on a mobile device. So It doesn't have to be a complex thing, given that the other protections that we've talked about and the other panelists have talked about today are in place, notably some live verification that a correct vote was received. That's really the key to the entire thing. So I think we can solve the network problem. We can solve the application problem. The other processes that go around it, that's the more complicated part.
If you were responsible for a secure voting system, what would concern you most? What would keep you up at night about devising a system that can work?
Yeah, as I indicated at the end of my testimony, I would be most concerned about the availability, the fact that you may have members with poor internet connections or no internet connections, unreliable internet connections. You may have adversaries that specifically target those members if they know what the vote's going to be, and you can prevent those specific members from voting. You may potentially be able to throw the vote in a direction or another. So again, backup systems are really critical, and there's different ways to engineer those that I think involve humans rather than necessarily involving technology that can end up making things safe.
I appreciate it. Professor Rubin, different legislatures in state houses across the country and across the world have taken different approaches on this. As you highlighted, some require legislators' emails and signed and scanned ballots. Others have created apps. When you think of the possibility of the House having a vote remote system, is there a particular system or framework that comes to mind that's something you would counsel us to consider?
I think that if we had to recommend a particular system, the first step would be to gather the experts together and brainstorm that. And I think Dr. Wagner presented some very compelling ideas. For example, the pre-recorded video of the vote, as well as what's been discussed, such as a web server and an app. I think the key underlying all of these is the ability to look in real time and decide if there's been a problem and identify it right away. And I think as to the availability question, for example, the first thing you could do if you're voting on a phone and there's been a denial of service attack, perhaps switch from your Wi-Fi to your cellular provider and see if that works. If that doesn't work, then the next step would be to alert somebody and to have a mechanism in place in advance that would make it easy to alert someone saying, I'm trying to vote and my vote has not been successful, and then have a procedure for getting that vote in some other way.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair. Yield back.
Thank you. So I'd like to recognize myself for a few questions. Mr. Crowell, members of the House are all over the board in terms of their familiarity with technology. Are there secure methods of remote voting that you think would be more user-friendly than others?
Well, certainly. In fact, I would agree with what Avi Rubin said, that a purpose-made application running on a browser or running in an operating system would be the most complete approach and would make it easier for the members to vote, no matter what device they were using to vote on, because these are commonly available on all of the devices. Purpose-built because you want the voting to be very, very easy. A yes or yay or nay button for the vote itself. Clear identification of what the matter is in front of you, and so that there's no ambiguity about what you're voting on, and the ability to record all of these things, not only in real time, but for posterity, since these become public records.
Right.
All of that has to be done securely, and it can be in a purpose-built system, as opposed to trying to patch together various apps that were never intended to support voting.
Mr. Green, I wonder if you have thoughts on how votes that were cast remotely could be integrated with the votes cast in the chamber from a technological standpoint, given that the system we have is air-gapped with one-way data flow.
Yeah, I think integrating those systems would be ideal, so that you don't have a 100% remote or a 100% in-person type of voting operation. ultimately, it seems like you're going to need somebody to sit there and push the right button or somehow feed those systems in. Probably that's somebody sitting on site in the House chamber, or at least in the building there. And again, as long as the member voting remotely can see that and see the result of that, that can be done fairly safely.
Dr. Rivest, in your testimony, you mentioned that the most an adversary would be able to do in a particular system would be to delete or duplicate votes. Can you explain what sort of measures could be taken to protect against deletion or duplication of votes?
Thanks. Great question. I think some innovation in the procedural aspects of voting in the House might help a lot. One thing that occurs to me here, hearing the discussion, would be to be able to file a default vote ahead of time so that you can say, should my internet go down, should I be unable to communicate, this is how I would intend to vote on this bill. But then after hearing the debate, as Speaker Gingrich suggests, you change your mind, or you have other influences that cause you to rethink the vote, you can file either remotely or in person a new vote that would override the default. So something like that could be one way of mitigating the risk of having unavailability, which is a risk that's pretty unique to remote voting compared to in-person voting.
Right. Dr. Rubin, it is important that we authenticate. We've all talked about that the vote being cast is being cast by the member herself. Do you think we should consider, if we move to this, any kind of tech system, a biometric authentication as part of a multi-factor authentication system? And if so, would that be an iris scan?
So biometrics are very powerful, and if designed correctly, they can provide a useful factor. I am a big fan of multi-factor authentication, so I think that if there were a way to integrate an iris scan, such as what you get when you unlock an iPhone today, well, that's face recognition, it's not an iris scan, but some biometric to that effect. If you could initialize the system in advance with what a person's face is like, and then integrate that into the authentication at the time, that would be beneficial. But I also think that we can achieve authentication without that. So it's just one of the tools in the arsenal that we have that can help us when we design a system.
Dr. Wagner, would technology that uses a lot of bandwidth make denial of service attacks more likely? Would it be better to utilize technology with low bandwidth and more fault tolerance?
Thank you. I don't think that should be your primary consideration. What I would recommend is the primary way to mitigate denial of service concerns is to have a fallback method. Don't have effective technological ways to absolutely prevent denial of service attacks. So the primary defense is to have some other alternate channel that can be used in the event of a problem.
Let me ask you this. Should we be concerned about man-in-the-middle attacks? And if so, what would be the best way to secure a system against that type of attack?
Certainly, man-in-the-middle attacks could arise if casting votes over the internet or over a telephony system where attacks are possible. And there are industry standard defenses that would be effective at preventing man-in-the-middle attacks. For instance, many of us have referenced end-to-end encryption, which is a effective defense. So I think using industry standard mechanisms would be a reasonable way to defend against those attacks.
Thank you. I see my time has expired, so I want to thank all of the witnesses for this enormously valuable testimony. I would note that the Resolution 965 requires this committee, quote, to study the feasibility of using technology to conduct remote voting in the House. So that's what we're about. We have different views on whether we should or shouldn't, but our task was to examine the technology and to be able to certify to the House if we're able to determine that an operable and secure technology exists to conduct remote voting in the House. The testimony received today is enormously helpful in helping us to complete the task that has been assigned to us. And I would like to note for the witnesses that the members may have additional questions for you. And if we do, we would ask that you respond to those questions in writing, and the hearing record will be open for those responses. You know, this is an important question for all of us. Nothing is perfect. And I was listening to members. I have missed votes, not because of a denial of service attack, but because United Airlines took off late and I didn't make it in time to go to the House floor. I agree, Mr. Gingrich, there's really nothing to substitute for members going on a codel together and getting to know each other. But that's not happening now because we're following the advice of the attending physician. And, you know, I love being on the floor when the mix of members, everybody is running around and talking to each other and getting letters signed, but that's not happening either because the attending physician is saying we have to go in groups of 20 and then leave. The votes are taking a very long time because of the need for social distancing. So in this pandemic, our situation has changed. We look forward to the time when the conflagration of this pandemic has abated. I envy you there in Rome where you're not actually with the kind of wildfire that is currently eating through America with this, not just America, but my own state of California, where thousands and thousands of positives are logging in every day. It's really a very serious matter.
If I might, Madam Chairperson, I just want to say, I think for the purpose you were assigned to ascertain whether or not it is technically doable, this was a superb hearing. And makes me proud to once again be briefly part of House administration. I think you had terrific guests, and I think they all did a very fine job of outlining the technical possibilities. So thank you for allowing me to be part of that.
Well, thank you. From a former speaker, that's great praise indeed, and we appreciate it. With that, I want to thank all the members for their participation, ask unanimous consent to put into the record a letter received from Demand Progress, and keep the record open for other material that members may wish to add to the record. And with that, we are ready to adjourn, and I will take my gavel and virtually tap it. We are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.